United States, the Soviet Union, and Cuba. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis like you've never heard it. The Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the most ubiquitous terms associated with the infamous Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Most of what is taught surrounding this monumental event in U.S. history is that the world narrowly avoided a nuclear holocaust. The part of the Cuban Missile Crisis much of the general public knows about is such a small percentage of the story. Often left out are the foreign policies, decisions, and internal political affairs that played a pivotal role in the conflict itself, and the impact it had within the U.S. for a considerable amount of time afterwards. Furthermore, did we really even come that close to a nuclear war with the USSR? Let's first set the backdrop. After World War II, the world was left with two world powers with drastically different socioeconomic governing beliefs: the US and capitalism versus the Soviet Union and communism. Expanding territories of influence were major and costly priorities following the Great War. The United States offered economic and military help to the likes of Greece, South Korea, and South Vietnam, while the Soviet Union and other pro-communism groups gained influence over most Eastern European nations and China. You might be asking yourself, where does Cuba fall into this? Well, Cuba and other Latin American countries felt neglected by the Europe-focused U.S., which spurred several communist revolutions. Fidel Castro, Cuba's communist leader, instigated what would become the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro's domestic popularity became greater when he sided with the USSR, and his government brought Soviet weapons and personnel close to further pressurize the United States into a more pro-Cuba political deal. Understanding the events that contributed to Fidel Castro's anti-American politics are key to understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis as a whole. U.S. President John F. Kennedy was a staunch anti-communist from the beginning of his tenure in 1960 and demonstrated a continued hardline policy towards Castro and Cuba. Kennedy-led U.S. officials created Operation Mongoose, which would cost $13 million to train guerrilla warfare tactics in Cuba. Additionally, the CIA offered the Mafia $150,000 to kill Castro. Adding to the U.S.-Cuba tension was the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, perhaps the most notable failure of JFK's presidency. On April 17, 1961, Cuban exiles trained by the CIA officers in Florida and Guatemala invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The attempt completely failed, and Castro took 1,113 prisoners. Meanwhile, Soviet technology had perfected a small nuclear warhead for their newly developed missiles. By 1962, they were ready to be deployed, and 42 of these medium-range missiles were sent into Cuba. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev hoped that the nuclear presence in Cuba, which put most of the continental U.S. within range, could be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations leading to a neutralized Germany. From the Soviet perspective, the neutralization of Germany would help Moscow convince China to cease their own nuclear program. But in actuality, it was the ignition for what many deem as the closest the world has ever come to a full-scale nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis officially lasted 12 days, from October 16, 1962 through October 28, 1962. However, there were several build-up events that played vital roles in launching this particular issue, from normal foreign policy, Cold War antics, to a potential nuclear war. After the previously mentioned Bay of Pigs failure, American action plans were made to further needle Cuba in their relationship with Soviet Russia. On October 2, 1962, just 2 weeks prior to the crisis, President Kennedy was given a recommendation action plan by Acting Secretary of State George W. Ball. This plan included the following. First, the President should close all U.S. ports to all ships of any country that carries arms to Cuba. Second, the President should direct that no government cargo shall be carried on a foreign flag ship if the ship is used in a communist bloc Cuba trade. And finally, that the President should direct that no U.S. ship nor U.S.-owned ship shall carry goods to or from Cuba. These actions built upon the February 1962 trade embargo that Kennedy had already imposed, and as you can imagine, they agitated negotiations. On October 14th, U-2 spy planes photographed the missile sites under construction in Cuba. 2 days later, President Kennedy convened a secret crisis management committee, including Robert McNamara, David Dean Rusk, and McGeorge Bundy, among others. Kennedy and his most trusted advisors discussed the U-2 photographs, weighed out responding actions, and evaluated their own nuclear arsenal abroad. An airstrike was discussed, as President Kennedy asked about its potential effectiveness and follow-up steps. Kennedy stressed secrecy. As he stated, maybe a lot of people know about what's there, but what we're going to do about it really ought to be, the tightest, because of all otherwise we botch it up. That same day at 7 p.m., the Department of State received a telegram from the embassy in the Soviet Union. This telegram expressed Khrushchev's disappointment in the U.S.'s attempt at stopping Soviet airplanes from flying into Cuba. Specifically, Khrushchev was noted as calling this blockade, quote-unquote, adding fuel to the fire. Additionally, this note made clear that Khrushchev was not happy about the U.S. making demands of Cuban activity, yet stationing their own weapons in surrounding Turkey, Italy, and Pakistan. On October 20th, the National Security Council conducted a meeting involving Kennedy, CIA officials, defense officials, and several White House staffers. This meeting unearthed and informed those that there were 16 SS-4 missiles with 1,020 nautical mile ranges that were now operational in Cuba and could be fired roughly 18 hours after the decision to fire was taken. There's no doubt, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons locked and loaded in Cuba. However, how close were they really to a nuclear war that would inevitably destroy both of the world's superpowers? After some back and forth between President Kennedy and Khrushchev, Soviets agreed to dismantle the Cuban bases in return for a no-invasion pledge. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had been a major contributor to this peaceful ending, suggesting that his brother John reply to Khrushchev simply not addressing his request of the U.S. to disarm in Turkey. The ploy worked. Officially, on October 28, 1962, Chairman Khrushchev's message to Kennedy included the notable lines, "We are not threatening, we want nothing but peace, and we value peace perhaps even more than other peoples because we went through a terrible war with Hitler." Despite the intensity surrounding the event, it's clear that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union wanted to remain peaceful in negotiation. Many accused Kennedy of political gamesmanship interfering in the build-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. One thing was certain, the 1962 elections loomed large for the Democratic agenda and associated foreign affairs. Rep. Thomas B. Curtis of Missouri told voters in his district that the Cuban Missile Crisis was quote-unquote phony and contrived for election purposes. The congressional elections were held November 6, 1962, and the claim that presidents play politics with foreign policy during these electoral seasons is often well-founded. It's certain that politics preoccupied Kennedy in the fall of '62, as even with a Democratic-controlled Senate and House of Reps, many domestic proposals were halted because of falling short of a working majority of votes. Once Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, it instantly became a political issue within the United States. Republican leaders continuously mounted attacks against the Kennedy administration as a Soviet arms buildup in Cuba began. One thing was for sure. If the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't dealt with promptly and peacefully, it could have caused major problems for Democrats in the congressional elections, and an even bigger problem for Kennedy in the presidential election to follow. In hindsight, Kennedy handled the situation admirably, which catapulted his popularity within the United States. This presents a unique duality surrounding American politics of this period. Kennedy and Democrats used the Cuban Missile Crisis to increase Democratic voter turnout, while Republicans claimed the entire situation was faked or easily avoidable to help capture additional Senate and House seats. Furthermore, Republicans painted the Cuban Missile Crisis as a disaster, as many politicians ran their campaigns on the issue. A political cartoon published in November 2, 1962, shows a Democratic donkey holding up a sign that reads, "Read all about Cuba," while the following Republican elephant is questioning the donkey's motive, stating, "But only a couple weeks ago you were begging me not to mention the Cuban issue." Despite the political uproar surrounding the crisis itself and the following election, the facts are the facts. Party alignment barely changed in the 1962 election. Democrats only lost 4 House seats and Republicans gained only 2. With so many incumbents being victorious, did the election results in fact stem from voter reaction to the crisis? In reality, the intrusion of the crisis into campaign season may have left Democrats largely unaffected. The theory that voters tend to disfavor newcomers in times of crisis holds true here. The Cuban Missile Crisis benefited Senate and House incumbents while remaining party agnostic. Despite years of rumors, conspiracy theories, campaign smearing, and more, the effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis seem indiscriminate. The crisis helped some Democrats and hurt some Democrats. The exact same can be said for the Republicans. As pointed out in the very beginning of this documentary, the Cuban Missile Crisis is perhaps the most infamous event of the entire Cold War between the United States and Soviet Russia. After examining foreign trade and domestic political impacts, it's rather easy to draw the conclusion that this event wasn't buoyed by any manifested extracurricular influences. Basically, the event was what it was. A political dialogue and shuffling between two world superpowers who wanted nothing to do with nuclear war. Understandably so, the general public viewed this event with particular caution and anxiety. However, President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev both operated with caution and regard for their own citizens in the face of a nuclear standoff, and cooler heads prevailed.